what you just said, that has to be the conversation that every podcast host should see before they decide to open the mic and be a podcast host.
What makes a great podcast interview, which then makes a great podcast episode and therefore a great podcast? And I think it comes down to three things, what I call the 3 L's. Listen, learn, and lead. So, yesterday I was producing a podcast with a new host, and I was talking to them about coaching them really on what the best way to do their new interviews will be to be most effective for them, because this is a new thing for them. And I realized as I was listening to my own self-talk, it really kind of came down to 3 categories: the listening, the learning, and the leading. And let me break that down a little bit and let's have a discussion. One is, so many of us come to a discussion, if we are hosting a discussion or hosting an episode, and we want to achieve a certain goal. We want to get a certain amount of content out there. We want to deliver value for our guest. We want to, have certain keywords we want to hit. We want to cover a certain topic. We have our questions that our marketing team put together for us, and we want to make sure that we've hit as many of them as we can. We had a discussion with the guest ahead of time, and they have certain expectations of the things that they want to cover, whatever it is. So we've got a goal in mind. And what happens is we're so interested in hitting those mileposts that we forget to listen and be curious ourselves.
Yeah.
And although I know there's a lot of pressure on us to do a good job as a host, the number one advice I give to a new host is to not be hosty. Don't be a host. Be you. The best thing I can think of is, I put it exactly this way. Think of every podcast conversation as if you and your guest have coffee or cocktail, whatever you want, in a dark corner in a bar or a coffee house, and we are secretly recording you. And then you got the recording and said, you know what? Everyone should hear this. And then we put it out to the world. If you can capture that mindset, that's the perfect podcast interview, because you yourself, when you're talking to someone, you're listening to them most of the time, and you're curious and you want to learn along the way. It's a discovery process for you.
Let me share some of my learning experiences along the way, not to use one of your terms, but I have a podcast, Business and Marketing, and I've evolved, I think, as an interviewer because of those 3 things. You said what? Listen, learning, and leading, right?
Yeah.
And when I first began the podcast, I would have a list of 8 questions. And this is for like a 30, 40-minute podcast. I had 8 questions.
That doesn't seem like it should be that many questions, right?
It seems like it's not, but it's a lot of questions. And after the first few episodes, I realized 8 was a lot of questions for 2 reasons. One, I was focused on getting to the next question, which means I wasn't listening. And then when I learned I need to listen, I began listening, which led to more questions, which means that I had more questions to ask than I had listed, and I ended up with 15 questions. So today, between finding out that if I listen, I'll have more questions, I typically don't enter into a podcast with any more than 4 questions. 4. Because I intend to listen. And as I listen, I'll have more questions come up in context of what they said. I will learn something, which will allow me to lead by adding in what I know about what they said. And that makes me a leader, but also I show that I learned something from them, which leads me to ask another question so I can learn more.
So powerful what you just said. And it leads me to 2 thoughts. One is, a great tip for the podcast host is, you may have more than, let's say, 3 or 4 questions. But the truth is, if you're listening, you may not end up asking more than 3 or 4 of the questions you thought of ahead of time. So a great way to organize for that is put down all the questions within a reasonable number that you want to cover, and then highlight on your notes the ones that are must asks. And then as you watch the time tick by and you've been really engaged with your guest, you know that, okay, I got to skip over question 2 and 3 and I got to go for question 4 because that's a must ask. And that just helps you not scramble and go, oh my God, I have 5 minutes left and 6 more questions to go. And that it just throws you. And then you later you go, oh, I should have asked the other question. So that's the first, it's a tip.
Let me share a tip right there. So let's say I have these 3 or 4 questions, not 8. Or if I have 8 listed, I need to prioritize them, right?
Right.
So 2 things I do. One, I try to make sure that if I have questions that are related to each other, I make sure they're close to each other on my list.
Smart.
That way, there's a good chance that they'll answer the other questions with the first one. Like if you say, what are your favorite restaurants? Question 1. And question 2 is, what are your favorite foods? If question 1, they say my favorite restaurant is Luigi's because I love lasagna, I can eat it every day. They've already answered your second question. What are your favorite foods?
Absolutely.
So you want to have them close to each other so you can know, because I've heard podcasts where the second, third question, they already answered it. And the host doesn't look that good. I won't say intelligent, but like as a listener, you know they just answered that question. Why did you stick so strictly to your list that now me as a listener has lost respect for you as an interviewer because I know you weren't listening?
Which actually leads me to the second thing I was going to say, which is by listening, really listening, I believe truly, Lee, that one of the greatest gifts you can give a listener as the host to keep them engaged, to make them want to be engaged, is for them to feel like you and them are of like mind.
Mm-hmm.
That you just asked the question they just had on their mind. Oh my God, that's exactly what I wanted to know. Thank you for following up on that and digging deeper and pulling back the onion and not going on to your agenda you had as a host. It's exactly what I was thinking. That creates such an affinity and a relationship with your audience, which means that as you truly listen, I think the role of the interviewer must be to be curious and to want to learn something, not just to be a shepherd of information they already know.
Let me speak on that a moment because that leads to the question of people ask us often, should we do pre-interviews for our podcasts? Now, to each his own. For me personally, I do not do pre-interviews.
I don't either.
Yeah. Now, I've been on a lot of podcasts, and those podcasters have had me to do a pre-interview with them, and I gladly do it as a guest. But when I'm giving a podcast, I've found that some of my curiosity fades away if I know what they're going to say already.
Absolutely. Now it becomes a performance of the previous original version of Discovery that you had before, instead of learning and going, wait a minute, I didn't know you were a lawyer too.
Exactly.
Instead, you find yourself going, aren't you a lawyer too? I mean,
the reaction's gone, the emotion's gone, the reaction's
exactly.
gone, becomes a script.
So that learning and that discovery leads you to ask normal human questions and follow up. You have normal curiosity. And instead of moving on to whatever your agenda was, honestly, Lee, I think a more compelling interview is if the first question you ask leads you down this rabbit hole of amazing and interesting information that there's just layer upon layer, and you never got to the 7 other questions you had. In my mind, maybe that didn't accomplish all the topics you wanted to cover. Maybe that wasn't as SEO rewarding for you. But as a listener and engaging people to stay with your content, man, mission accomplished, because you really had a real human conversation.
And as you go down that rabbit hole, because you're right, that sometimes that first question may be all you need for the conversation, especially if you're truly curious. And I think the important thing to remember there is, if you go down a rabbit hole of just continuous questions, be sure that you stay in the lane of your audience.
Yeah.
So for example, I'm a marketer. If I'm having an interview with another marketer and I'm asking about SEO, for example, and we get on a rabbit hole, if they tell me a story about, SEO, and they mentioned they took their daughter to New York on a trip, I don't want to go, I love New York. What did you and your daughter do there? that's the wrong tangent, right?
Right.
I'm listening, I'm engaging, but I may lose my audience. I want to go deeper on that topic and let it go wherever it goes within those lanes, because I have to keep my listener in mind throughout the whole conversation.
I think that's the difference between a podcast talking at you or with you as an audience. Do I feel like I'm sitting in the room with them as a fly on the wall watching this unfold, or is this essentially performative at me? And I think subconsciously we really want to be a part of it. We wish we were there. We wish we could be a part of the conversation. I wish I was that guest. I wish I were that podcast host. And by feeling like it's unfolding in front of us in real time, in a way,
Yeah.
it feels genuine, and we want to engage with it, and we want to see what happens next, because who knows what could happen next. And so that curiosity matters. That also leads to the possibility of fun, because
Yeah.
the unexpected brings laughter, it brings humor, it brings surprise, and even the opportunity to ask questions or deliver prompts to your guest that surprise them is important. In fact, one of my my tricks, if you will, to get a podcast off the ground. So many podcasters, and I understand why, they start with so Dave, tell me about yourself, or give me a short bio or whatever. I think that this is and forgive me, podcast hosts everywhere, I think this is a tremendously lazy way to start a show, and I think
Plus, you lose control immediately.
you're missing the opportunity. What I would rather do is, I call it jumping into the middle of the pool and swimming back, instead of
Yes.
starting at the front of the pool and swimming to the middle of the pool. I would rather start with a question like,
Hey, marketers, imagine harnessing the power of conversations to elevate your brand's authority and visibility. With Content Monster's podcast production services, you create a platform to connect with executives and subject matter experts, fostering relationships that position your brand as a thought leader. Our expert team collaborates with you to craft engaging podcasts, which can be repurposed into videos and social media content, maximizing your reach across platforms. Don't let content creation challenges hold you back. Partner with Content Monster to transform your marketing strategy and reach more customers. Visit contentmonster.com today to get started.
I would rather start with a question like, okay, we're going to learn more about you in a second, but what I want to ask you is,
Yes.
I know that your business did a big pivot 10 years ago from this place to this place. So, by the way, I just delivered some important information we can explore, right? Without a big explanation. What was that like for you as a person to experience that moment? Okay, I just shocked my guest into a place they didn't think they were going, but not in an uncomfortable, insulting way. I got them to go to a place of humanity and emotion and feeling, and make them into a real person. And boy, the audience is going to go, they're on the edge of their seat right now. They're like, this is interesting. This is what life is. This is why I listen to a show like this, is to find out these moments. Once you've got them with that real information, that humanity, now you can talk about technical stuff. You can talk about bios. You can talk about all the context of everything. But give me the sizzle before you give me the steak. And in fact, that even goes with how you even talk about introducing someone. I know we've talked about this probably before, but if you're going to tell someone's bio, don't deliver the bio. Ask your guest to share the bio, or even better, give them a question that will allow them to explain their background as a way of answering the question.
That's the best way. I like that the best. To give them that question that requires them to give you some background as to why they're the authority to answer that question. So I think that's one way. The other way is, like you said earlier, we're going to go back to that. And because for me, my journey in podcasting, I started out giving, first I tried two things. One, I would either give the introduction to say, hey, this is Jim. He did this, he did this, he did that. But that took a bit of time, and I had to make a lot of effort to make it interesting enough versus just reading a bio to keep
Right.
people's attention. But I also learned my second attempt was, why don't I just let them talk about themselves? Well, that didn't work. And I'll tell you why, what you'll typically find out. Either one, they'll be so modest that it'll be short answer and won't be entertaining to your audience, or they'll meander too long. They'll say more than you would have said introducing them. They go into things that may be promotional or boring or whatever. And here you are a minute or two in and you haven't gotten to the first question. So I think we both agree that the best case is to jump right into the questions and then
Exactly.
frame your questions in a way that they will tell you who they are.
Which I think goes to the importance of leading as a host. So
Yes.
I believe truly that your guest on a podcast is only there for one of two reasons. They're either there because they know you and they're doing you a favor, or because there's some value to them in their world or their business to participate. Either way, frankly, no matter who they are and their station in business, they want to do a good job. They want to deliver. They want this to be a success. They want to deliver. They're looking to you to, in most cases, unless they have this massive ego and they don't listen to anyone, which does happen, but hey, what are you going to do? They are looking for you for guidance and cues as to how to do that. For example, maybe they don't want to talk too long. They want you to dig deeper because they don't know how far to go. So they need you to give them a reason or a way to do that and some guidance, and they'll deliver. Or they're going to keep talking. They're going to fill up the available space until you tell them to stop talking.
Wait, I got something there.
Yeah.
Two things that I learned. First of all, when I interviewed Seth Godin, I noticed he was good at stopping. He would answer a question and just stop. Long pause. And it forced me as a host to segue, to answer the next question. It forced me to listen because he
Right.
might stop at any minute. But that taught me also how to be a better guest, to learn how to have shorter answers and stop. But as a host, you have to control people who don't know how to stop. That's
Exactly.
the key. And the way I do it, my method is I listen to what they say very carefully, and I try to find a way to hook back into what they said. In other words, so Jim, you mentioned radioactive material. Let's go deeper into that. Or what do you think about that? That allows me to either give him a signal that, hey, you hit a light bulb. My facial expression lights up. Hopefully Jim sees me going, I want to say something. Like my mouth is saying, I want to say something.
Yeah.
Jim pauses, and I can go back and hook into something that was juicier than where he's going.
By the way, again, the value of really listening.
So a funny story about the listen part. Now, when I am hosting a podcast, I have my list of questions on a different screen that I can put in front of me, between me and the person I'm talking to. So I'm still looking directly at the camera, but I'm also reading the next question. So early on in my career of doing this, I was reading my questions and I wasn't listening to what the person said because I was looking directly at them and reading. I did not know that this thing happened until months later when my mother was watching one of my podcasts and she burst out laughing. And I was like, what was so funny? She's like, well, first of all, your guest said something funny. And I laughed at them. And then I laughed at you because you didn't laugh. I'm like, what do you mean? What are you talking about? So
You weren't listening.
I wasn't listening. I went back to the episode, and sure enough, the guest said something really dry and funny. And I had this stone face because I'm reading text. I'm like this. It's ridiculous. So yeah, it was so important. I learned then that you have to also listen to give back the proper expression and response if you're truly listening.
You know, on that note, by the way, you got to ask yourself why you're doing this recording in the first place. Are you doing it because, again, you're just trying to shepherd the information in front of your audience? I know all this stuff. I got nothing to learn from this person. I'm just using them, the guest, to promote myself, and maybe that's true. But if you think you have anything to learn from them, then for God's sake, why are you not listening to them? They're delivering gold to you.
Yeah.
Unless you're editing your own interview, in which case I guess you'll listen to it then, or unless you plan to spend another half an hour out of your busy life to listen to it later when it's too late to ask them a follow-up question.
Yeah, and I think it's a good litmus test to, first of all, listen very closely while you're interviewing someone, and then go back and listen to your own show. And if you learn more as you listen back than you did while you were having the podcast, that's a sign maybe you weren't listening enough. If you're a marketer struggling to create content that's truly unique to your brand, here's the key. Your experts and executives are your most valuable content assets. Conversational content like videos and podcasts featuring your team stand out above all other content. So, instead of creating content that sounds just like your competition, start leveraging the unique voices inside your company. Thought leaders and authentic conversations build credibility and engagement. At Content Monster, we specialize in remote content production, meaning we coach your people to be comfortable on camera, then we capture and produce high-quality videos and podcasts featuring your team and customers. No need for expensive production crews, long production plans, or complex setups. Want to see how it works? Visit contentmonster.com today to learn more.
But I want to invite hosts they do not have to be polite for a half an hour and never interrupt their guest. If their guest is going on and on and on,
please interrupt them.
It is okay to interrupt them if you do it in the right way. And a great way, if you feel like you're not going to get to your other questions, they're boring, you think they're filling the available space and waiting for you to stop them, whatever you think the case is, you can stop them and say, "Wait, Jim, hold on a second. I love what you're saying, but you just said something amazing. And I want to unpack that a little bit."
You know what? That was good because you interrupted them, but you also gave them a compliment.
Exactly. So you haven't you haven't disrespected them. You valued what they were saying, and you even said we could continue, but before we do, I don't want to skip over this golden nugget you just said. Let's dig deeper on that because it's so great, right? And because the thing is, again, your audience is going, well, wait, why are you still going? I wanted to talk more about the golden nugget. And you showed the audience you're listening just like they were. And so that's a good way to and then one other thing about leading in the interview is there's making the good interview, and then there's it doesn't matter how good an interview is if nobody hears it. So one of your best ambassadors for sharing your interview may be your guest, who they themselves may have a very engaged and sizable network. But you have to give them, if they thought the interview was terrible, or they thought they were terrible, or there wasn't a lot of great content out of it in their estimation, they may be less motivated to robustly share this everywhere they can. They may just do a perfunctory, like your post kind of cooperation. So instead, if you can ask questions that you believe they will likely want to share, if you understand the things they're talking about, are listening to them, and can ask follow-up questions that can stage them into saying something that probably will be useful to their cause, then you can pull those excerpts or those shorts, those clips, and give them to them as incredible ammunition. They're going to be like, this is gold, baby. This is great for my LinkedIn feed or my newsletter or whatever, because this is exactly what I've been trying to put out to the world, and it was encapsulated in the most beautiful way that's useful. So that's, again, you leading your guest for them to be successful, and therefore your podcast to be successful. So again, for me, all the things we just talked about comes down to 3 categories: listen, learn along the way, and from that comes all these other wonderful cascade of things. And then lead your guest and your audience, frankly, into what can be very useful and promotable content.
Mark, what you just said, that has to be the conversation that every podcast host should see before they decide to open a mic and be a podcast host.